Yeah. Yeah. The lot gives way before daylight reaches the parking lot. Rainwater still clinging to the curb, while a narrow strip of light escapes beneath the doorway and stretches across the pavement like the building forgot to sleep. A pair of gloves is the bench, hard enough to wake the silence. Tape already pulled tight across knuckles. Time already running, sweat already finding its way down the canvas. Long before the city remembers what time it is outside. Delivery trucks drift through empty intersections and traffic lights keep changing for nobody. Meanwhile, a rhythm starts building behind concrete walls where impact arrives in steady waves, and every echo sounds like it knows exactly why it showed up. The hallway smells like effort that never fully left around, still hanging in the air. Yesterday refusing to disappear before the day gets a chance to begin. Rain keeps sliding down the windows, turning street sign into blurred streaks of color, while combinations keep snapping through the room with enough force to erase whatever excuse survived the drive over. A coffee shop opens 3 blocks away. Somebody unlocks an office downtown. Another day starts negotiating comfort across the city. Yet somewhere between the bell and the next breath, the different agreement takes shape. The pace shifts. Footsteps cut sharper angles. The timer feels louder. The bag swings wider. Energy starts stacking faster than thought can organize it. Every strike sends another signal through the floor. Another reminder that momentum belongs to whoever reached it first and refused to hand it back. Now the windows begin glowing with the first trace of morning. Shadows pulling away from the corners while the tempo climbs. Impact chasing impact, movement feeding movement. Every second gathering weight as the room accelerates beyond ordinary conversation. Brain loses the argument. Fatigue loses ground. The clock keeps advancing but somehow falls behind the pace. Combinations arriving before hesitation can finish forming. Pressure building faster than comfort can react. Everything narrowing toward work and nothing else. By the time sunlight finally spills across the parking lot, the hardest part of the day already happened. Somewhere behind closed doors, hidden beneath heavy drums of leather on canvas. Hidden beneath that for most people never witnessed. Hidden beneath a routine that started long before arrival. The door stays open. The timer keeps moving. The work was already waiting. Yeah. I made it all the way home. Dropped the keys on the counter, kicked my shoes toward the wall, and stood there, staring at nothing while the refrigerator hummed like it had something important to say. The wraps were already in the trash. The workout was already over. The schedule was already complete. None of that helped. A bruise across my cheek caught the bathroom light at the wrong angle, and suddenly the combination from 2 hours ago replayed itself with better timing than I used the first time. That bothered me more than it should have. Enough to grab the keys again before the thought finished forming. The drive back felt shorter, maybe because the argument was already decided. Rain dragged itself across the windshield while every red light became an interruption instead of a traffic signal. The parking lot looked abandoned. Good. No conversations waiting, no explanations required. Just a building full of unfinished business. The lock clicked open, the smell hit first. Leather, dust, old sweat home. A heavy bag hung motionless for exactly 1 second before the first punch changed its plans. That missed angle from earlier showed up immediately, then another, then a third. Each one worse than I remembered, each one impossible to ignore. Some people collect receipts, some people collect photographs. Tonight collected mistakes. A hook landed cleaner, the problem survived. Footwork improved, the problem survived. Speed increased, the problem stayed alive. Hours disappeared into corrections that kept creating new corrections, turning progress into a moving target. Stubborn enough to stay 1 step ahead. The windows turned black, then gray, then something closer to morning. Didn't notice. A truck rattled past outside. Didn't notice. A phone vibrated somewhere in a locker. Didn't notice. The world kept submitting updates. None of them made the final cut. Another adjustment finally connected the way it should have the first time, and for half a second everything felt quiet. Not finished, quiet, big difference. The bag swung away carrying the answer. The return swing brought another question. Perfect. That meant there was still a reason to come back tomorrow. The first thing I noticed that morning was a parking ticket folded beneath my windshield wiper. Rain had turned the paper soft around the edges and smeared the ink just enough to make the amount look negotiable. It wasn't. Neither was the rent due next week. The missed call from my mother sitting at the top of my screen, or the message from an old friend asking if I was still alive. Funny question. Most days I felt more present inside a boxing ring than anywhere else. The gym was already awake when I arrived. A delivery driver was unloading bottled water near the entrance, while one of the amateur lads jogged laps around the building with his hood pulled tight against the cold. His shoes looked newer than my car. Good for him. There was a time when fresh equipment convinced me I was becoming somebody. These days I trusted mileage more than appearances. The smell hit before I reached the changing room. Leather, disinfectant, the faint trace of yesterday's sweat still hanging in the air like a conversation nobody had finished. A pair of gloves sat on the bench beside me, not mine. The stitching had started splitting across the thumb. Whoever owned them was probably making the same calculation every fighter makes eventually. Buy new gear or keep pretending the old stuff. There's one more month left in it. The bell started and the room shifted gears. Nobody announced it. Nobody needed to. Bodies began moving with the kind of understanding that only comes from repetition. Pads cracked somewhere behind me. A skipping rope slapped rhythm against concrete. The heavy bag nearest the wall started swinging before the rest. I took that as an invitation. The first few rounds felt like an argument with gravity. Every movement arrived half a second late. My jab kept returning home slower than it left. The sort of thing nobody notices from outside the ropes, but feels enormous when you're the one throwing it. By the middle of the session, the noise inside my head had finally begun to thin out. That's the part people never talk about. They think boxing is an outlet for anger. Mine usually work more like a filter. The pointless thoughts disappeared first. The imaginary conversations, the regrets that only sound intelligent at 3 in the morning. Eventually all that remained was distance, timing and breath. Simple things, reliable things. A younger fighter asked if I still enjoyed training after all these years. I almost answered immediately. Then I realized I wasn't sure. Enjoyment wasn't the word. Training had become something closer to maintenance, like fixing a roof before winter arrives. Ignore it long enough, and everything underneath starts suffering. He nodded anyway. Maybe he understood. Maybe he was too polite to admit he didn't. When the final round ended, sunlight had already climbed through the high windows and settled across the ring. Dust drifted through the beams without urgency. Nobody seemed in a hurry to leave. A few fighters stayed behind talking about upcoming bouts. Someone laughed. Someone complained about making weight. Life continued in all its familiar shapes. Back in the car, the ticket was still waiting beneath the wiper. The rent was still due. The missed call was still there. Nothing outside the gym had improved. I started the engine anyway. For years I thought strength meant solving every problem placed in front of you. Lately I've started suspecting it means carrying them without letting them choose your direction. The road home stretched empty ahead. For once, that felt like enough. This coach spent the press conference talking about power. Interesting choice. Power is visible. People trust visible things. The real damage usually arrives disguised as something smaller. A half step taken too wide, a shoulder lifting before a jab. An exit that always leads through the same door. Most fights start ending long before the opening bell. That's why I watch film without sound. Commentators fall in love with excitement. Excitement hides information. The footage tells better stories when nobody is narrating. Third round, 2 minutes left. He circles away from pressure and reaches for the same reset every time. Not a habit, a location. There's a difference. The camp became simple after that. No speeches, no dramatic predictions, just thousands of repetitions aimed at a future moment that hadn't happened yet. People imagine confidence as a feeling. I've never trusted feelings. Feelings wake up different every morning. Preparation is much more reliable. The locker room stayed quiet before the fight, not intentionally. There simply wasn't much left to discuss. The work had already happened. Conversation couldn't improve it. The gloves were wrapped, the game plan existed. Everything important had been decided days ago. Walking toward the ring always reminds me of airports. Everybody arrives carrying something. Expectations, nerves, predictions. Very little of it survives the journey. The opening round confirmed what the footage suggested. His feet wanted one thing, his instincts wanted another. That's expensive at this level. Small disagreements become large consequences. A minute later, he reached for that familiar escape route. The same one. The one he thought belonged to him. My right hand arrived first. The crowd reacted, I didn't. Reactions, waste time, there was still a fight happening. The interesting part came afterward. Not the punch, not the count, the adjustment. People remember impact. Professionals remember what created it. Back in the corner, my coach said it was beautiful. I understood what he meant, didn't fully agree. Beauty suggests surprise. Nothing about tonight was surprising. The result had been hiding inside the preparation for weeks. The ring just revealed it. That's all competition ever does. It introduces the truth at high speed. Most people call that pressure. I call it measurement.
A reporter stopped me outside the arena and asked whether I expected a knockout. The question followed me all the way to the locker room. Not because it was difficult, because it wasn't. People always want the exciting answer. Predictions sell better than preparation. Nobody asked how many mornings started in darkness. Nobody asked how many miles were covered before the city woke up. That part gets edited out. The cutman finished working on my gloves and slid them across the bench. I picked them up the same way I picked them up hundreds of times. Nothing felt different. That's usually a good sign. Danger hides inside unusual emotions. Too excited, too nervous, too confident. A professional learns to distrust all three. Across the hallway, another fighter's team was making noise, music, laughter, voices bouncing off concrete walls. Maybe that's what they needed. My attention was already occupied. The fight had started weeks ago. Tonight was just where the audience caught up. When the walk began, the crowd rose together. Thousands of people trying to influence an outcome they couldn't touch. I understood the effort, I just couldn't use it. The ring has its own language. It doesn't care who sold more tickets. It doesn't care who won the press conference. Everything gets translated into time, and eventually the opening minute told me enough. His feet arrived before his balance did. A small detail that kind of disappears unless you spent your life looking for it. By the second round, he was solving problems I had already prepared answers for. That's the value of a proper camp. You don't chase moments, you meet them. His corner started asking for adjustments. Mine stayed calm. Nobody was surprised. The work had already been done. A fight should never be the place where decisions are born. It should be the place where decisions are confirmed. Halfway through the contest, I caught a glimpse of my coach leaning against the ropes. No panic, no urgency, just the expression of a man watching the blueprint become a building. That look meant more than any applause. Championships aren't built under bright lights. They borrow the lights for a few minutes. Construction happens somewhere quieter. Roadwork before sunrise. Empty gyms, meals measured on scales, days that nobody photographs. The final bell arrived without drama, I like it that way. Drama usually means mistakes. My hand was raised, the crowd celebrated the result. I was already thinking about the footage. Somewhere inside 12 rounds there would be an error. There always is. The belt mattered, winning mattered. But tomorrow morning, somebody would load the fight onto a screen and press play. That's where the next improvement was waiting.
That's where champions stay. Champion, 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 champion.
The belt sat on the passenger seat during the drive home. Not because I wanted to look at it. The case wouldn't fit in the trunk. Funny how people imagine success. They think it'll rise with fireworks. Most victories leave the arena quietly and get stuck in traffic like everything else. A young fighter stopped me outside a grocery store 3 days later. Asked what it felt like to become champion. I told him the truth. The feeling lasted less time than the training camp. He looked disappointed. Can't blame him. People love summits. Nobody buys postcards for maintenance. The hardest part started after my hand was raised. Before that, every decision pointed in one direction. Win the title. Simple, clean. A target gives structure to sacrifice. Ownership creates different problems. Now every meal carried a consequence. Every skip session left a footprint. Every lazy morning signed paperwork for somebody else's future. That's the agreement nobody reads. The belt doesn't belong to you. It rents space in your life. Miss enough payments and it finds a new address. One morning I ran past the mural painted on the side of an old building. The artist had finished the face perfectly. The eyes, the expression, every detail. Rain had already started erasing the signature that stayed with me. Recognition always fades faster than effort. That's why I trust routines more than applause. Applause is terrible attendance. Routine never misses a day. A sponsor invited me to dinner after a successful defense. Nice restaurant, private room, expensive plates carrying very small portions. Half the people at the table kept talking about what I'd accomplished. The other half wanted to discuss what came next. I learned a long time ago which group is more useful. Yesterday doesn't need assistance. Tomorrow usually does. Training camp opened again 2 weeks later. The heavy bags hadn't changed. The ring hadn't changed. Even the old clock above the entrance was still running 3 minutes slow. That felt reassuring. Titles create distance if you let them. Word closes it. A fighter entering his first amateur bout and a champion preparing for a defense still have to solve the same problems. Breathing, discipline, execution. Reality remains stubborn like that. Late one evening, I unlocked the gym and found nobody inside. No music, no voices, just the hum of the lights and my reflection moving across the glass. For a moment, the place looked exactly like it had years ago. Before interviews, before sponsorships, before cameras follow me in the parking lots. That version of me would have stared at the championship belt for hours. The current version checked the calendar and started planning the next camp. Growth changes what impresses you. The crown isn't heavy because of gold. It's heavy because everybody thinks it's yours. Deep down, champions know better. We're only holding it until somebody proves otherwise. Everybody wants to stand beside a winner. Makes the photographs look better. That's why I never learn much from celebrations. Defeat introduces people properly. Success usually skips that part. The first lesson came years ago. Small venue, cheap gloves, a crowd large enough to make noise but not large enough to remember names. One of the guys I trained with swore he'd be there. Said it 3 times, sounded sincere every time the opening bell arrived before he did. Funny how life starts teaching early. I stopped taking attendance after that. The sport kept moving. Different gyms, different cities, different locker rooms filled with men pretending they weren't nervous. Same story underneath. Everybody talks about brotherhood while things are working. Pressure always edits the speech. A fighter loses twice
and suddenly half the advice disappears. A bad injury clears a room faster than an argument. Reality has efficient ways of counting people. That's not bitterness, that's inventory. The older I got, the more useful that distinction became. One keeps you angry, the other keeps you accurate. A coach can sharpen tools, a sparring partner can expose mistakes. A good team matters. Anybody who says otherwise is lying. But none of them hear the final instructions from your side of the ropes. None of them feel a shot land clean and immediately start calculating what changed. That part belongs to you, always has. The crowd thinks courage arrives all at once like lightning. Most courage looks much smaller, showing up after a bad performance, walking into a gym when confidence stayed home, starting another camp while old scars still complain about the previous one. Nobody puts those moments on posters. Those moments build the people on me. Around midnight last winter, I finished training and sat alone in the parking lot because the engine wouldn't start. Snow gathered across the windshield, the battery had given up. The title belt was sitting in the back seat, didn't help much. Couldn't turn an ignition, couldn't push a car, couldn't solve the problem. A passing mechanic eventually stopped and got me moving again. Before leaving, he looked at the belt and asked if being champion felt different. I told him the truth, the road home still gets dark. Bill still arrived out, still knows your address. He laughed, probably expected another answer. Most people do, the ring teaches strange lessons. One of them is understanding that respect and dependence aren't the same thing. I appreciate the people around me, I always will. But when the bell rings and the space between two fighters disappears, every borrowed belief gets returned to its owner. What's left standing in the center belongs entirely to you. That's why I sleep fine. Not because life became easier, because eventually I stopped expecting anyone else to carry my rounds. The responsibility fits better now. Like gloves broken in overtime, tighter in some places, worn down in others, still mine. The first time I lost my temper in a fight, I won the round and nearly lost the night. Funny trade. The crowd loved it, my coach didn't. He spent the entire walk back to the locker room explaining why emotional victories usually send expensive invoices later. Took me years to understand what he meant. Most fighters spend camp studying opponents. I spent part of mine studying reactions. A missed punch, a bad call, an accidental head clash, tiny moments with a strange amount of influence. None of them can end a career on their own. What happens next sometimes can. One guy in a press conference promised he'd drag me into a war. The reporters enjoyed that sentence more than they should have. Conflict has good marketing, discipline doesn't. 3 weeks later, he spent half the fight waiting for me to become angry. I spent half the fight collecting points by the final bell. We had both received exactly what we trained for. The strange thing about emotion is how convincing it sounds in real time. Every bad idea arrives dressed like an emergency. That's why I stopped trusting the first version of any feeling. Pain exaggerates, ego improvises, frustration writes terrible game plans. Breathing tends to be more reliable. Late in camp, I watched a young amateur smash a heavy bag so hard he tore the strap, holding it to the ceiling. The room exploded, cheering, laughter, high fives for a minute. He looked unstoppable. Then he spent the next 10 minutes waiting for someone to fix the equipment. The session had paused because excitement confused itself with progress. That lesson stayed with me. Power impresses people. Control wins long arguments. A fighter across the ring can see your emotions before he feels your punches. The shoulders tighten, the feet rush, the eyes start searching instead of seeing. Information leaks everywhere. Good opponents know how to read it. Great opponents know how to create it. That's why composure matters. Not because it looks cool, because it protects the truth. When the final rounds arrive, the body always starts negotiating. Every fighter hears the same offers. Slow down, take a break, stop moving. Champions don't ignore those voices, they simply refuse the contract. Somewhere between the ropes, I learned something useful. The goal was never becoming fearless. Fear has a purpose, anger has one too. Doubt occasionally tells the truth. The real skill is deciding who gets access to the steering wheel. Most disasters start when the wrong passenger grabs it. The hotel gave me a room high enough to see the city. Thousands of lights, thousands of windows. Somebody arguing in one of them, somebody celebrating in another. Somebody probably staring at a ceiling, wondering how things got this complicated. Funny, a championship fight makes people think everything is clear. Tomorrow wasn't clear at all. The suitcase sat open beside the bed, mouthpiece, hand wraps, a hoodie I've owned long enough to remember who I was when I bought it. Most things change. A few things stay behind to keep score. The phone buzzed around midnight. A message from an old training partner. He wished me luck and attached a photograph from years ago. Small local show, bad lighting, cheap gloves. Two kids standing in a ring pretending they understood where boxing would take them. I stared at that picture longer than I expected. Neither one of us looked worried, that's youth. You don't know enough to doubt yourself properly. Experience teaches different lessons. The television replayed highlights from previous champions. Commentators love certainty after the fact. Everybody sounds like a genius once the result already exists. Nobody broadcasts the conversations fighters had with themselves the night before. Those tapes will be more honest. A fighter in the room next door dropped something heavy. The sound traveled through the wall. For a second I imagined them all going wrong. Not dramatically, just enough. A punch I didn't see, a cut opening early, a decision that arrives one round too late. People think doubt always asks whether you'll win. Sometimes it asks smaller questions. Those can be harder to answer. I walked to the window. Rain had started falling over the city. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement. A taxi moved through the intersection below. The driver probably had his own worries. Bills, family, health, the future. Funny how pressure keeps changing clothes. Nobody escapes it. We just meet it in different places. The truth is, I've never entered a fight completely certain, not once. The amateurs, the title eliminators, the championship bouts. Every version of me carried questions into the ring. The difference came later. At some point I stopped treating uncertainty like an enemy. It's just evidence, evidence that something matters. Nobody loses sleep over things they don't care about. The clock moved past 2 in the morning. The city became quieter. My thoughts finally followed. Tomorrow would arrive whether I felt ready or not. The bell wouldn't ask for confidence. The referee wouldn't ask for certainty. The ring never cared about either. It only wanted honesty. I could give it that. The rest would sort itself out. The first thing people notice about anger is the noise. That's because they're usually standing too close to it. Mine got quieter with age. Back when I started boxing, every bad day wanted a victim. Traffic, bills, arguments, didn't matter. I carry all of it into the gym and throw punches like the heavy bag. Owe me money, the bag never complained. My coaches did. One of them stopped the sparring session halfway through and asked what exactly I was trying to hit. At the time I thought he was talking about my opponent. Years later I realized he wasn't. Fight week has a strange way of making old lessons return. You spend months preparing for one man, and suddenly everybody else wants a piece of your attention. Reporters, promoters, friends who haven't called in 6 months. People love standing near pressure as long as somebody else is carrying it. The arena sat across the river from my hotel. I can see the lights from the window. Every few minutes another truck arrived through the service entrance. Production crews, equipment, catering, an entire machine being assembled around 2 people trying to solve a problem with gloves on. The scale went well that morning. Good. One less conversation. I hated conversations, especially the ones fighters have with themselves when the room gets quiet. Those usually cost more than the opponent. By evening the city felt electric. Everybody wanted predictions, everybody wanted certainty. I had neither. What I had was evidence. Roadwork in the rain, sparring rounds that started before sunrise. Ice packs balanced across bruised ribs while answering messages I was too tired to read properly. The work existed whether anybody believed in it or not. That was enough. Inside the locker room, somebody from the commission checked my raps. A television mounted in the corner showed highlights from previous title fights. Crowds roaring, hands raised, history compressed into short clips. Look different from where I was sitting. Nobody films the boredom, nobody films the waiting. Nobody films the 1,000 ordinary decisions that eventually become a dangerous person. The walk to the ring felt familiar. That's how I knew I was ready. Fear always tries to make things feel unusual. Preparation does the opposite. Across the rope stood a man who'd spent months planning to hurt me. I respected that. Would have been strange not to. Then the referee stepped away. Everything unnecessary left with him. The anger was still there, same place it's always been. Locked behind the door, breathing slowly, waiting for instructions. I never asked it to leave. I just taught it who was in charge. My sister sent a picture while I was cooling down after training. And for a second, I thought somebody had accidentally posted an old memory. Because everybody looked younger in my head than they did on that screen. The table was packed, candles were already lit. Somebody had written my name on a place card and left the chair empty. Even though everybody knew I was 300 miles away, getting ready for a fight, most of them would only watch for 30 minutes. I smiled when I saw it. Not because I felt guilty, because I knew exactly why I wasn't there. That gets easier with time. People imagine sacrifice as one dramatic moment where you choose one path and permanently abandon another. But most of it happens quietly while you're busy doing something else. You miss one dinner because camp is starting. You skip another because you're cutting weight. A holiday turns into road work. A weekend becomes sparring. Then one day somebody shows you a photograph and you realize an entire season disappeared while you were chasing an improvement too small for anyone else to notice. The strange part is, I never felt robbed by it. Nobody tricked me into this life. Nobody dragged me into a boxing gym and locked the doors behind me. Every mile was chosen. Every session was chosen. Every early morning and every late night carried my signature long before they happened. That's why I never understood complaining about the price after agreeing to the deal. Halfway through camp, a young amateur asked whether becoming champion was worth everything I missed along the way. The question stayed with me longer than he probably intended, because I wasn't sure the answer could fit inside a conversation between rounds. Worth is a difficult thing to measure. Some people count memories, some count money, some count achievements. Most of us spend years switching between all three without noticing. What I do know is this: the same discipline that kept me away from certain moments also carried me toward others I never would have experienced otherwise. I've watched the sun come up from roads that were completely empty except for my footsteps. I've shared gyms with people whose stories would never appear in newspapers, that taught me more about resilience than any headline ever could. I've stood beneath bright lights knowing every difficult decision from the previous year helped build the version of me standing there. That means something. Maybe not to everyone, definitely to me. When I got home that night, I looked at the picture again before putting my phone away. The empty chair was still there. So were the people who cared enough to leave it open that felt bigger than the absence. The fight would eventually end. Another camp would eventually begin. Life always keeps moving. What mattered most was knowing exactly why I was where I was when the picture was taken. Some choices take things from you. The good ones give something back before you even realize the exchange happened.
Last winter, I took a wrong turn after road working and ended up driving through a neighborhood I hadn't seen in years. The kind of place that still looks familiar even after life removes all the people attached to it. A convenience store stood where an old diner used to be. Somebody had painted over the mural near the bus stop.
And the apartment building where one of my first trainers lived had new windows that somehow made the whole street feel less honest. I sat at a red light longer than necessary because memories have a way of ignoring traffic laws. Back then I thought boxing was taking me somewhere. A title, a ranking, a bigger arena, something you could point at on a wall. Age has a strange sense of humor. You spend enough years chasing destinations before realizing the road was doing most of the work. The fighter who started this journey would have hated hearing that. He wanted certainty, he wanted milestones, he wanted proof that all the sacrifices were adding up to something he could hold in his hands. I understand him, I just don't agree with him anymore. Somewhere between early morning runs and long drives home after sparring, the purpose changed without asking permission. The session stopped feeling like steps toward another achievement and started feeling like conversations with the version of myself that only showed up when the work became difficult. That's the person I learned the most from. Not the one standing beneath bright lights, not the one posing for photographs, the one who kept moving when nobody would have blamed him for stopping. A few weeks ago, a young fighter asked what keeps me motivated, and I could tell he expected an answer dramatic enough to write down. He looked disappointed when I told him motivation rarely survives long careers. Direction does. Direction wakes up on mornings when motivation misses the alarm. Direction shows up during bad camps and difficult seasons, and stretches of life where progress feels too small to measure. Motivation gets the headlines, direction handles the schedule. The gym was almost empty when I locked up tonight. Somebody had forgotten the water bottle near the ring, and a pair of gloves hung over the ropes, waiting for their owner to remember them tomorrow. For a moment the place looked exactly the way it did when I first walked into a boxing gym. Not because nothing had changed, because the important parts never do. There's always another fighter trying to improve, always another lesson hiding inside a mistake, always another reason to come back and see what happens if you stay with the process a little longer. People ask what remains after enough years in this sport. The answer isn't confidence, it isn't toughness, it isn't even the belt. What remains is trust. Trust that the road still knows where it's going, even when you can't see beyond the next turn. It's been enough for me lately, more than enough. The coach once handed me an old fight on DVD and told me to watch it without sound, which felt pointless at first, because I already knew the result and could still remember the scorecards without looking them up. What I didn't remember was the 8th round. Funny how memory works. The knockout stayed famous. The mistake that created it almost disappeared. I sat there watching a younger version of myself circle to the wrong side of an exchange, and it struck me that the punch wasn't really the story, the decision before it was. Most people think regret lives inside disasters. Mine usually hides in smaller places. A sparring session where I learned the right lesson 6 weeks late. A conversation with a coach I should have listened to instead of defending my ego. An opportunity to rest that I confused with weakness because I was too stubborn to understand the difference. Time has a strange habit of promoting minor moments after they're finished. Back then they looked ordinary. Years later they return wearing uniforms at rank. A young fighter asked me recently whether losses still bother me. The question made me smile because losses stopped being the loudest memories a long time ago. Some victories bother me more. There are nights when I remember getting my hand raised and immediately think about an opening I never used. A championship belt can sit on a shelf for years while an unfinished idea keeps pacing around your head looking for somewhere to land. That's the curse of experience. The longer you stay in the sport, the easier it becomes to notice invisible things. Everybody in the crowd saw 12 rounds. I saw the 20 seconds that changed them. Everybody remembers a result. I remember a hesitation. Those aren't the same story. A few months ago, I found an old notebook from training camp with a page full of adjustments I'd planned to make before a fight. Most of them were crossed out. Life moved on.
New camps arrived, different opponents appeared. Still, I caught myself staring at one unfinished note in the margin. The handwriting was terrible, but I knew exactly what it meant. Not because the adjustment mattered anymore, because the version of me who wrote it believed he had more time. Maybe that's what regret actually is. Not wishing for a different past, understanding how valuable a moment was after it stopped being available. The film ended. The room went dark. My reflection appeared in the television screen for a second before I stood up and switched it off. Somewhere out there, another fighter was probably making a decision he'd spend years thinking about. That's the thing nobody tells you. The biggest moments in boxing rarely announce themselves before they arrive.
The first thing that changes isn't speed. People think it is. That's because speed is easy to see. What's harder to notice is how differently you spend an afternoon once you've learned there aren't endless afternoons waiting in storage. A younger version of me would have stayed after training, throwing another 100 punches just because exhaustion felt productive. These days I pay attention to different things. A shoulder that feels slightly off, a round that took longer to recover from, the quality of sleep after sparring. Small details become valuable when the calendar stops behaving like an unlimited resource. Last month, the prospect joined camp for a few sessions and spent most of his free time talking about where he'd be in 5 years. Good kid. Serious worker. Reminded me of somebody. I listened more than I spoke. Eventually, he asked what I thought his future looked like. I told him the truth. 5 years is a long conversation. Tomorrow morning deserves more attention. He laughed. I wasn't joking. Boxing taught me that distance can be deceptive. A title defense gets announced 6 months away, and suddenly people start acting like 6 months belongs to them. It doesn't. The future has terrible attendance. Only today reliably shows up. That's why I still love the early parts of camp. The gym hasn't made promises yet. Nobody knows how the story ends. The work remains honest because speculation hasn't had time to interfere. This morning I arrived before sunrise and found one of the amateur fighters already running on the treadmill. The machine counted every step. The kid kept checking the screen. Numbers matter. I've got nothing against numbers. After enough years though, you start noticing things that never appear on displays. The decision to keep going when a session turns ugly. The discipline to leave when you've done enough. The patience required to improve something that refuses to improve quickly. Those are harder to measure. They're also harder to replace. A photographer asked me recently whether retirement crosses my mind. Of course it does. So does next week. Thinking about something doesn't mean you're leaving for it. The road eventually ends for everybody. The knowledge stopped bothering me once I realized it was also the reason every mile mattered. By the time I locked the gym tonight, the parking lot had emptied and the city was settling into its usual rhythm. Mine felt different, not slower, not faster, just more deliberate. There was a time when I trained because I believed opportunity was somewhere ahead of me. Now I train because opportunity keeps arriving every morning, disguised as another ordinary day. Missing one used to feel harmless. These days, it feels expensive. Every gym has one guy who seems permanent. The kind of person new members assume works there because he's always around, even though nobody's paying him to be. A few years ago, I realized I'd become that guy. The kid working reception changes every couple of months. Fighters come and go. Amateur careers start, end and disappear into ordinary life. Yet somehow my key still finds the same lock before sunrise in my bag. still ends up beside the same section of wall. Nobody planned it. It just happened one training session at a time. Last Tuesday, a teenager asked whether I was getting ready for something important. I told him I was getting ready for Thursday. He laughed because he thought I was joking. That's the difference between people chasing moments and people building habits. Thursday matters when enough Thursdays stack on top of each other. Most careers are assembled that way. Not with dramatic breakthroughs, not with movie scenes, with ordinary days that refuse to stay ordinary once enough of them accumulate. Around lunchtime, I stopped at a supermarket and bumped into an old sparring partner who hadn't trained in years. We spent 10 minutes talking near a freezer full of discounted food while he told me about work, his family, and a fishing trip he'd taken the month before. Before leaving, he asked if I was still boxing. The question caught me off guard. Nobody asked a carpenter if he's still carrying wood. Nobody asked the ocean if it's still making waves. Some things become part of the landscape, so gradually that explaining them feels strange. By evening, I was back in the gym, listening to gloves hit leather somewhere behind me while a local amateur prepared for his first bout. The nervous energy coming off him reminded me of a version of myself that felt impossibly far away and somehow only a few weeks old at the same time. Funny how memory stretches and compresses depending on what it's holding. When training finished, there wasn't a crowd waiting outside. No cameras, no interviews. Nobody cared what time I left. Honestly, that's one of the things I love most about the sport. The work remains honest when nobody's watching. A mile doesn't become easier because it gets recorded. A round doesn't become harder because nobody saw it. The value stays attached to the effort. That's a rare thing. Driving home, I passed a billboard advertising a concert that would probably sell out by the weekend. Thousands of people cheering for a few hours before heading home. Nothing wrong with that. I just realized a long time ago that my favorite sound isn't applause. It's the noise a gym makes right before training starts, when everybody is quietly getting ready and the room hasn't decided what kind of day it's gonna be yet. The sound has kept me coming back longer than any spotlight ever could. The doctor showed me the scan, like weather on a screen, pointing at a small bright line near my shoulder, while explaining what time had been doing quietly without asking for permission. I nodded like I understood every word. Truth is, I understood enough. Some things don't need medical language to make their point. By noon, I was sitting in my car outside the gym with a bottle of water getting warm in a cup holder and a bag of ice melting into the towel beside me. Watching younger fighters walk through the entrance, carrying bodies that still believed recovery was automatic. Good for them. I mean that. Jealousy is just grief wearing cheap cologne. And I already had enough strange smells in my life without adding another one. The old version of me would've turned this into a war against the past, trying to prove the mirror was lying, trying to drag yesterday into a sparring session it never agreed to attend. That kind of pride looks powerful until it starts making decisions for you. Inside the gym, the afternoon session had that slow summer feeling where even the heavy bag seemed to swing with less urgency. Coach asked how the shoulder felt, and I gave him the answer fighters give when the real answer has too many moving parts. It'll warm up. He looked at me long enough to say he didn't believe it, then handed me a lighter pair of gloves and walked away like mercy didn't need a speech. We worked on angles instead of power, timing instead of volume, touch instead of punishment. The younger me would've called that compromise. The current me calls it staying in the room. There's a difference, and most of the difference is earned through things you didn't choose.
Halfway through the session, rain started hitting the windows hard enough to make the whole place sound like it was training with us. I kept thinking about water, how it never argues with shape but somehow keeps moving. How it can carry a ship, carve stone, ruin the ceiling, fill a lung, save a life, disappear in the air and come back later wearing a different name. Maybe that's acceptance. Not becoming soft, not giving up the fight, just learning which parts of yourself need force and which parts need direction. A kid asked why I was throwing less than usual. I told him I was listening more. He laughed because he thought age had made me poetic. Maybe it had. Or maybe after enough years in boxing, every joint becomes a small translator, and every ache starts reporting from somewhere the ego refuses to visit. The round ended with no applause, no lesson announced, no dramatic moment worth clipping for anyone's feed. Just me leaning against the ropes, breathing through the kind of pain that doesn't shout anymore because it knows the house well. For a long time I thought toughness meant refusing to change. Now I think it might mean changing without asking the world to congratulate you for it. When I left, the rain had stopped, and the parking lot was full of shallow puddles holding pieces of the sky. I stepped around the first few, then gave up and walked straight through the rest. My shoes got wet. Nothing terrible happened. The first thing I do when fight footage starts isn't watch the punches. Because punches are loud and loud things attract attention they haven't earned. What interests me usually arrives a few seconds earlier, hiding somewhere inside a routine movement that nobody in the arena remembers afterward. A fighter adjusts his lead foot before circling. A shoulder relaxes when pressure leaves the exchange. An eye drifts toward the exit before the body follows it. People call those details small because they measure size instead of consequence. That's an expensive habit. Years ago, I sat beside a coach who kept pausing tape at moments that looked completely unimportant. The room would groan every time he reached for the remote. Nobody wanted another lesson. Everybody wanted action. Then he'd point at something none of us noticed and spend 5 minutes explaining why the next 3 rounds were already hiding inside that frame. The older I get, the more I understand him. Most outcomes introduce themselves long before they arrive. The introduction just isn't dramatic enough for television. Last month, a fighter spent an entire press conference talking about power while the reporters nodded along like they'd discovered gravity. Meanwhile, his feet kept crossing whenever he left an exchange, moving to his right. One fact sold tickets. The other one sold information. Only one of them interested me. People think focus means staring harder. I've never found that useful. A flashlight can blind you just as easily as darkness if it's pointed at the wrong thing. The trick isn't seeing more. The trick is deciding what deserves attention before the noise starts negotiating for it. That's why I like arriving early. An empty gym tells the truth. The building hasn't started performing yet. You hear the chain above the heavy bag creak when it swings. You notice which ropes need replacing. You learn things from silence that crowds accidentally erase. Somewhere along the way, concentration stopped feeling like effort. It became subtraction. The same way a sculptor removes stone until the shape appears, I learned to remove distractions until the answer became visible. A fighter standing across the ring isn't a mystery to solve. He's a pattern unfolding in real time. Every choice leaves fingerprints. Every habit casts a shadow. By the middle rounds, those shadows become easier to track than the punches themselves. A lot of people leave arenas talking about what happened. I usually leave thinking about what almost happened. The opportunities nobody recognized. The mistakes that escaped punishment. The tiny decisions balanced on the edge of changing everything. Those details stay with me longer than highlights ever could. Maybe that's why I keep returning to the gym after all these years. The sport never runs out of information. It just hides it in places most people stop looking.
A reporter stopped me after training and asked whether I felt pressure heading into the fight. The same way people have asked that question for years, as if anxiety is supposed to surprise somebody who spent half his life preparing for difficult nights. I told him pressure isn't a visitor anymore. Visitors leave. This stayed. Somewhere along the way it moved its clothes into the closet and started paying rent. He laughed. I wasn't trying to be funny. The gym looked different when I was younger. Back then, every session felt connected to some future version of myself that I couldn't wait to meet. I chased rankings, opportunities, bigger rooms, now the work feels simpler. I know who I'm showing up for. That removes a lot of unnecessary conversations. A prospect joined us recently and spent most of his breaks talking about what people were saying online. Somebody doubted him. Somebody criticized his style. Somebody predicted he'd lose. I listened for a while before asking whether any of those people planned to help him during Roadwork the next morning. That ended the discussion. Opinions sound heavier than they are. Most of them disappear the moment real effort enters the room. The strange thing about certainty is that it rarely arrives through success. Winning can make people careless. Applause can make people confused. The strongest belief I ever built came from surviving days when nothing seemed to improve and continuing anyway. Those days leave deeper marks than victories. A few weeks ago, I found an old notebook from an early training camp and almost didn't recognize the person who filled those pages. Every entry sounded urgent, every setback felt enormous, every obstacle looked permanent. I don't blame him. Experience hadn't introduced itself yet. Time teaches certain lessons more effectively than coaches ever could. Tonight the gym emptied out slowly. A heavyweight stayed behind working on the same combination long after everybody else finished. The janitor was waiting to lock up. Neither man seemed interested in leaving first. Something about that made sense to me. Real commitment usually looks ordinary from a distance. No dramatic speech, no music playing in the background, no audience leaning forward in anticipation. Just a person deciding that the task deserves another few minutes. I've seen enough fights to know outcomes are never guaranteed. Cuts happen, hands break, judges disagree. Life enjoys reminding people who's in charge. That's fine. Certainty was never about results. Results belong to the future. My responsibility lies somewhere much closer. It lives in the alarm clock, the running shoes by the door, the schedule folded inside my gym bag. Those things have never needed motivation. They've never needed approval. And they've never once asked me to explain myself. That's probably why I trust them more than arguments. You worried? The question came from the corner while my hands were getting wrapped. No, you should be. The room laughed. Not because it was funny, because fighters enjoy pretending concern is wisdom. Across the locker room, somebody was pacing holes into the floor. Another guy kept checking the clock like staring at time could make it move differently. Fight night creates strange rituals. Everybody swears theirs are important. Mine mostly involves sitting still.
You don't look locked in.
I am.
Then why are you smiling?
Because none of this feels new. The raps felt familiar. The tape felt familiar. Even the nerves felt familiar. People talk about confidence like it's some rare animal you have to chase through the woods. I never saw it that way. Confidence shows up late, usually after the work already happened. A few seats behind the ring, somebody was explaining to his friend how the fight would end. Wrong prediction, strong voice, classic combination. The sport has always been generous to certainty before the bell. Afterward it gets more selective. The commission official opened the door. 5 minutes, the room changed immediately. Conversations disappeared. Water bottles got emptied. Everybody suddenly remembered what they were here for. My coach looked over. You good? Same question, different meaning. Yeah.
That answer wasn't about courage, wasn't about talent either. It came from thousands of rounds nobody remembers, roadwork with nobody watching, sessions nobody filmed, mornings that looked identical until they stacked high enough to become a career. The thing about preparation is it solves arguments before they start. By the time I stepped into the arena, the outcome was still unknown. That's normal, outcomes always are. What wasn't unknown was whether I'd done the work. That question had already been answered months ago. The bell rang, nothing magical happened, no sudden transformation, no speech inside my head, just recognition. The same feeling you get when a key finds the lock it was made for. Some people trust luck, some trust momentum. I've always trusted repetition. It's slower, less exciting, harder to sell, still works. Still works.
My name drifts across the arena before I reach the tunnel, stretched by a voice that learned it this afternoon and delivers it like we've shared history. As part of the business. Strangers inherit fragments of your story and speak on them with the confidence of witnesses. A camera catches the scar above my eye. Tomorrow it'll become evidence for somebody's theory. People trust visible damage because it saves time. Looking deeper requires patience. Most spectators never purchased with the ticket. The hallway feels smaller than television, makes it look fluorescent like concrete floors. Security staff fighting sleep, a ring waiting at the end of a corridor. The mythology arrives later, usually from people selling memories to those who missed the moment. Across from me stands a man carrying his own version of certainty. I respect that. Nobody reaches this distance by accident. Whatever doubts tried following him through camp got left somewhere behind locked doors and long nights. The crowd rises whenever movement suggests meaning. Human nature, one side hoping to witness greatness, the other hoping to witness collapse. Same arena, different investment. My gloves brush the top rope as I step through. The canvas settles beneath my feet with the familiarity of an old conversation that doesn't need repeating. Nothing dramatic happens, no revelation, no speech waiting inside my chest. That's the detail movies always miss. Most defining moments don't announce themselves, they simply begin. The referee speaks, my opponent nods. Heat from the lights erases everything beyond the ropes until the world shrinks to distance, timing, and consequences. Good. The extra details were never part of the assignment. Years of preparation reduce themselves to ordinary actions performed without hesitation. A man reaches for an opening, another man notices. Choices get made, reactions follow. Everything complicated arrives disguised as something simple. People call that being forged. Maybe. I've always thought it looked more like subtraction. Noise disappears, excuses disappear, performance disappears eventually. There's nothing left standing between a person and the truth of what they built. The bell rings, no introduction needed. The work already said my name, forged.